That's fun. And then looking forward to the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration.
Good evening, everyone. Am I on? Okay. Hi, welcome. I'm so happy you're all here in the Zoom world. I'm Beth Allen. I'm the Deputy Director and Curator here at Morven, and we're so excited to have you here tonight. Before I begin, I wanted to introduce the newest member of the Morven Museum and Garden staff, our new Curator of Education and Public Programming, Greer Luce, who probably checked you in over there. Here she is. Greer comes to us from the New Jersey Historical Commission, and we're thrilled to have her on board as we look forward to exciting programming over the next few years. But since it's only her second week, we thought I would introduce Sheldon tonight. Jesse, our co-curator here in the front row, and I have developed a very special relationship with Sheldon over the last 3 years. I remember when Jesse first came across your name, Sheldon, in our early days of researching. She showed me a video on YouTube of you doing a tour of the beautiful corporate museum installation that you did. And we thought, oh, this is our guy. This is who we need to talk to. So it's very easy to come up with exhibit ideas, but it's not easy to find the stuff, the artifacts, the images that will allow you to tell the story. And so that's where Sheldon came in for us. It's not an understatement to say this exhibit would not look what it looks like without Sheldon's help. And so we're so excited to have him here tonight. Sheldon welcomed countless emails from Jesse and I. Particularly, I remember you being extra patient with me as I wrote and rewrote the label on the foil electric microphone, saying, I think what you mean is this. And he often knew what I meant better than I knew what I meant. So thank you, Sheldon. We had a blast doing it, and we're just thrilled with how it came out. Bio of Sheldon. Sheldon will give his presentation, and then Greer will come up at the end to facilitate question and answer, okay? So Sheldon is AT&T corporate historian and manager of the AT&T Archives and History Center facility in Warren, New Jersey. Sheldon joined the AT&T Archives as a historian in 1988. He has been studying the history of AT&T and US telecommunications ever since, and is a leading expert on the company's history. Sheldon holds a PhD in history of science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a BA in chemistry history from Reed College. In addition to his years at AT&T, Sheldon has served on the faculties of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, the University of Minnesota, and the Stevens Institute of Technology, and as a historian for the Röhm and Haas Company and the IEEE. He is the author of Röhm and Haas History of Chemical Company and co-author of the High Technology Company, a historical research and archival guide. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Sheldon.
Thank you, and thanks for that warm introduction. And yes, I had a blast working with you and Jesse over what was a lot longer than it was supposed to. The exhibit was supposed to open in 2020, and I think everybody knows why the exhibit didn't open in 2020. And you guys did great work. Okay, so I don't have to tell you who I am because that's just took care of that. So let's go to the next slide. Oh, what am I doing wrong here? Just click. Hit the main bit.
This little button right there.
This one here?
Yeah, that one.
Okay. Problem is I'm left-handed and the machines are all right-handed. Okay, so what I'd like to talk to you today about are 6 major innovations in the history of AT&T. And if you want to know why 6, it's because I have 45 minutes to give a talk, and I've discovered that how many stories I can tell in 45 minutes is 6. I have a longer list of like 28, but we'd be here all night. So these are the 6. So basically, these are the 6 stories I'm going to tell you, starting with the invention of the telephone itself, the high vacuum tube, sound motion pictures, which is kind of fun because you wouldn't think that came out of AT&T and the telephone, the transistor, communication satellites, and finally, cellular telephony. Okay, so AT&T itself is a company founded on innovation, and that innovation is the telephone. So the story of the invention of the telephone, by the 1870s, the telegraph was one of the biggest industries in the United States. Telegraph lines went everywhere and even crossed the ocean. Telegraphy was truly revolutionary. It was the first time you could send a message faster than it could be physically transported. If you've seen the Spielberg movie biopic of Abraham Lincoln, you saw the telegraph in action. He used it in real time to communicate with the generals at the front. This was the leading technology of the day. So a young person, and in this era it almost undoubtedly would have been a young man, who wanted to make his fortune and had a certain technical bent, might well look to try to make an improvement on the telegraph. If he could make an improvement on the telegraph, he could, if it worked, perhaps sell it to Western Union, the dominant telegraph company, and make his fortune. That's how Thomas Edison started. One of the many people who saw this was this young man named Alexander Graham Bell. Bell learned about the electricity hanging out in an electrical shop and worked to improve the telegraph. He was looking for something called a harmonic telegraph first, but what he was really interested in, and he realized that wouldn't it be great if instead of a one-way Morse code message, he could instead talk, have a conversation. He wasn't the only one who had this idea, but he was the one who succeeded because not only did he know about electricity, he knew about speech and hearing. His father had developed a system for teaching the deaf to speak and had trained Bell in doing that. Indeed, that's how Bell, as a young man, earned his living, was both training teachers of the deaf and teaching the deaf himself. So Bell came in 1874, and at this point Bell is all of 27 years old. He had the keen intellectual breakthrough. He said, what I need if I want to transmit the human voice over an electrical wire is not the staccato on and off of Morse code, but what he called an undulating current. But what he meant was, what he needed was an electrical wave that was analogous in shape and form to the sound wave. He established a little lab in an attic in Boston, got an assistant named Thomas Watson, who was even younger, who was 22, and went to work. In the fall of 1875, using a device like the one you can see on the right here, he was able to transmit speech sounds, but not intelligible speech. This is sitting down. He actually would have held it at 90 degrees from it. The part that's the base is the part you would have spoken into. On the basis of that achievement, he was able to file in February of 1876 an application for a patent. The patent was duly issued on March 7th of 1876, and I have the original of the patent in the vault at the AT&T archives. It's obviously one of the greatest treasures in the collection I manage. You'll notice it says improvement in telegraphy. The key improvement was he sent voice sounds. 3 days, I keep hitting the wrong button. 3 days later, on March 10th, 1876, using a different device, if you can see that cone-shaped thing on the desk, and this is a painting the company commissioned at the 50th anniversary, because there was no one there to take a picture, just the two guys, they weren't famous yet. He succeeded in transmitting intelligible speech. The first call was just one way, and it was from one room in the attic to another, and Thomas Watson ran down the hall and said, "I heard what you said." We know exactly what he said because Thomas Watson wrote it down in a standard stationery store notebook. And that is probably the single thing in the collection at the AT&T archives that gives me the most goosebumps. And it's kind of fragile. I mean, it's a standard stationery notebook from 1876. But here you can see the key part of the page on which Watson wrote down what he heard. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you." Then, "How do you do?" Then, "God save the Queen," and several other intelligible sentences. Bell was British, born and raised in Edinburgh. He later became a naturalized citizen, but why is he saying God save the Queen? Not because he thought we had our own queen. Anyway, on that basis, on the patent right, he and his initial financial backers and Watson formed in 1877 the first Bell Telephone Company to commercialize the patent, to turn it from a thing done in an attic to something people used. By the early 1880s, there were local telephone exchanges. This took lots of other people with lots more inventions in just about every place in the United States with more than 10,000 people. How they financed this was what we would call franchising. That is, they would license a group of business people in a city or town to operate a telephone exchange under license from the patent holder. By 1881, this was called the American Bell Telephone Company, which set up a subsidiary in 1885 called the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, AT&T, to build and construct long-distance lines connecting the local exchanges. Not surprisingly, the very first long-distance line connected New York and Philadelphia, the first one built by AT&T. And if you go into the museum, you'll see a cross-section of one of the poles from that very first line, which the company has preserved all these years, from somewhere in Burlington County. By 1892, the long distance had achieved its first real goal in connecting New York and Chicago, the nation's two largest cities, and put out this brochure. 1899, there was a company reorganization, and AT&T became the parent company of telephone system. Next, the high vacuum tube amplifier. So I was talking about reaching New York and Chicago. Well, to do that, used a very thick copper wire because there's resistance in a wire, and the signal gets weaker as the longer it goes. One way to slow that down is by using a really fat wire. Second way, developed in 1898, was something called loading coils, which slowed down the rate at which the signal got weaker. For that, you can get about 2,000 miles. AT&T President Theodore Vail in 1908 was a firm believer in networks, made the company's top technical priority building a line clear across the continent, making New York and San Francisco. He knew, and his chief engineer, his top technical person, John J. Carty, who you see in the picture here, knew that it was not a construction job. The technology to do a 3,000-mile circuit didn't exist. Carty knew what was needed. What was needed was a way to amplify the electrical signal. None existed. So what Carty and his chief lieutenant, a physicist named Frank Jewett, did was they went to the top physicists in the United States, Robert Millikan at the University of Chicago, and said, "Hey, you have a bright young guy finishing up his PhD who'd like to come to work for us and work on the problem." And the guy who did was the other person in this picture, Harold D. Arnold. Arnold goes to work on it in 1910. Meanwhile, AT&T sent out publicity to the community of people studying electricity saying, if you've got a device that'll do this, bring it to us. We'll buy the patent rights from you. You'll get a bunch of money and we'll be able to talk to San Francisco. In the fall of 1912, such a person, independent inventor Dr. Lee DeForest, came to AT&T with the device you see on the left, his invention, the Audion, the 3-element vacuum tube. It would do a small degree of amplification, but if you wanted to do the amount of amplification needed for a transcontinental telephone line, it would give off a blue haze and the whole system would break down. Arnold takes one look at it, and in part because Arnold had the most up-to-date scientific knowledge, which was electrons, but that was cutting-edge science back then, said, I know what's going on, I know how to make it work. That blue haze is residual gas in the tube interacting with the electrons that are trying to get from one pole to the other. All we need to do is improve the vacuum, and fortunately new, better vacuum pumps had just shown up, and it'll work. And so Arnold took what was the original Audion on the left and developed the high vacuum tube amplifier you see on the right. This is a laboratory model. You'll see commercial tubes in the museum. It worked. By the spring of 1913, they're testing them on the existing lines. It worked, and soon thereafter, it becomes a construction project. Now, one team builds out west from Denver. Another team builds out east from Sacramento, where there was a separate non-connected network going up and down the West Coast. They meet in Wendover, Utah, June 17th, 1914, completing the line, testing secretly, opening up to great fanfare, big, enormous amount of publicity on January 25th, 1915. It now is possible to call all the way across the country. Now, this did several things. Once you have a way of amplifying an electrical signal, you can do all sorts of other things with it. You can do flat frequency response microphones. You can use it for electrical sound recording. You can use it for public address systems. And you can use it to amplify radio waves. And that brings us to a nice New Jersey example. Where radio got used in telephony largely was for places where you could not string wires, like across the ocean. So here are two different venues in New Jersey. On the left, you have the transatlantic radio transmission installation in Lawrenceville. Since shortwave radio signals took the telephone conversations across the ocean until the first cable in the 1950s. And secondly, you see the ship-to-shore radio transmitter, Ocean Gate, Berkeley Township near the coast. You can't see the vacuum tubes, but if you were to open these transmission cabinets, they would be there. It did one other thing. It firmly convinced AT&T that bringing research in-house was a good, sound business strategy. And it led what had been the Western Electric Engineering Department, that is a department of the manufacturing subsidiary of AT&T, into its own high-profile subsidiary, the famous Bell Telephone Laboratories. At the left, you can see the original headquarters of Bell Labs on the west side of Manhattan. But there were, from the early on, installations in New Jersey, particularly for radio research, because, well, the middle of Manhattan is not a good place to do that. There's too much interference. So this is the original Holmdel Laboratory, picture taken in 1933, though the facility was a bit older than that. And there was a second radio research facility up in North Jersey in Whippany. This one's kind of fun because it's not the sort of thing you'd think, what does it have to do with the telephone? And the answer really doesn't, but it's a good story. So the guy on the left, Edward B. Kraft, vice president at AT&T, was looking at all of the ways AT&T had developed and applied the vacuum tube and said, you know, we've got everything you need to do sound motion pictures, synchronized sound and picture, except a way of doing the actual synchronization. And one of the examples here, this is an early electrical sound recording. AT&T invented electrical sound recording. The early phonographs, Edison's classic phonographs, did not use electricity at all. It's direct conversion between mechanical and sound energy. This is the Victor record company in Camden, New Jersey, with an orchestra laid out for one of the first recordings where they could like sit in normal positions and use normal instruments. He said, Kraft put together multiple teams to solve the problem of synchronization, both in recording and reproduction. Within a few years, they had succeeded, and here's the first this is 1925, it's just transitioned from Western Electric Engineering to Bell Labs, the first sound motion picture projector. You'll notice that there's a turntable in it. Well, sound on disc was better understood than sound on film, though the latter wasn't far behind. So if you lined up the cueing mark on the disc with the cueing frame on the film, it would be in synchronization. AT&T now needed to commercialize it. So they went to Hollywood. Hollywood wasn't interested. The big studios had an enormously profitable global business in silent films, and moreover had seen several earlier attempts at synchronized sound motion pictures come up short. So they found a small 3-year-old film company called Warner Brothers, who thought that if this worked, maybe they could use it to rise to become a major studio. It worked. So this is an early sound stage. The man sitting in the center of the picture in the tuxedo is that Edward Kraft, the AT&T vice president. The guy next to him is the conductor of the New York Philharmonic, pre-recorded soundtrack. And Sam Warner, you can't really see him because he's got his back to you wearing the vest. The first sound motion picture was actually not a talkie. It was John Barrymore and Don Juan. They took a silent film that was a foreign production, and they added a musical soundtrack conducted by from the New York Philharmonic. All silent films were never shown in silence. There was always a musical accompaniment. It could be an orchestra at a first-run theater in a big city and a guy playing the piano in a small town. But along with the feature, there was a whole series of shorts. And those are the names listed next to the word Vitaphone, which is what Warner Brothers called the system. There was a lecture. There was opera arios. There was pop music, guy playing a banjo. There was a big dance number where you could hear the tapping feet. One critic from the long gone paper called the New York World said, "You can keep Don Juan, give me the Vitaphone." It was a big smash, and within a couple of years, all the Hollywood studios had made the conversion to sound. And if you've been following AT&T recent histories, I mean, the ironic thing is, of course, AT&T bought Warner Brothers and then sold it off a few years later, but that's a whole separate story. Okay, the transistor. People ask me what are the most important inventions in the history of the company. Number 1 and 2 are easy, the telephone itself and the transistor. The transistor is the foundation of all modern electronics. Your cell phone's got billions of them in there. And this, now we are getting to New Jersey. as far as the inventions. So it starts in New York. In 1936, Bell Labs Vice President for Research, Mervyn Kelly, who you see here, is thinking to himself, what area of science would an investment, if it worked, lead to improvements in the telephone system, which of course is AT&T's business? And his answer was solid state physics for two reasons. First off, those vacuum tubes, they worked, but vacuum tube was not perfect. It first off had the fragility similar to an incandescent light bulb. It's glass. It's a glass bulb. Like the light bulb, it gave off a lot of heat, and like the light bulb, it would eventually burn out and have to be replaced. The second thing was, by now you had a transition to a large extent, though it was far from complete, from manual switchboards requiring operators. And there's some good examples and good films of that up in the museum building, to large building size electromechanical switches. Hundreds of thousands of moving parts. The parts needed to be adjusted, high maintenance. Eventually, moving parts wear out. So Kelly went and said, we need to start a program in solid state physics. There already was one guy there named Russell O, but he went out and hired three very bright young physicists. First, William Shockley, who you see sitting in this is a publicity shot from 1948, a theoretical physicist. Standing behind him, leaning on the equipment, is John Bardeen, a second theoretical physicist. And the third person is Walter Brattain, an experimental physicist. They go to work. In 1941, they are among the first groups to move from New York to the newly opened building in Murray Hill in November of 1941. This is what Murray Hill looked like in 1941, one of the first buildings. Shortly thereafter, all normal work stops at the labs for the war. People start working on R&D projects of interest to the war. Shockley works on sonar, for example. When the war starts winding down, they go back, they pick up where they left off. And in 1947, Bardeen and Brattain succeed in amplifying an electric signal with a solid state device, which becomes the transistor. On the right, you can see the picture of that first transistor and a one-of-a-kind thing built in the lab. On the left, you can see a page from another of the treasures I have in the vault, Walter Bratton's laboratory notebook. And this records, so December 18th, they succeed. December 23rd, 1947, they show it off to the hierarchy in the labs. And they show it off in a really effective way. So the transistor amplifies an electrical signal. They put that first transistor in a circuit with a microphone and a speaker and switched the transistor in and out of the circuit, and you could hear it amplify. It took 3 years from this, it took over 3 years from this to 1951 by a different group, a development group, to go from a one-of-a-kind thing built in the lab to something you could build in a factory in quantity at a reasonable yield. The first uses in 1951 are for the military. The Cold War is really going by then, Korea. And as you know, price is not a primary concern when it comes to military equipment. If you could save weight, if you could save reliability, you're putting a radar system in a plane. The commercial uses come not terribly long thereafter. AT&T freely licensed the transistors for uses outside of AT&T's business. And in 1954, the public splash, the first transistor radios, transistors manufactured by Texas Instruments under license from AT&T, and it's really the first truly portable music device. So in some vague sense, it's a long ago predecessor of just one of the zillion things your smartphone can do. The first uses within the telephone system follow in the same year, 1954, something called a card translator. But AT&T never forgot why they undertook the project. The picture on the left is the first electronic telephone switch. That's one of the things they were looking for. The first #1 ESS, which stands for Electronic Switching System, which opened for service in 1965 in Succothon, New Jersey, in Morris County. And then the other picture is the second generation switch, local switch, which starts in 1982. Okay, communication satellites. If you had the opportunity, you could have seen one of these satellites in the garden room in the museum, and a smaller sized scale model upstairs. So how did this come about? Well, it starts with a science fiction writer named Arthur C. Clarke. If you're a science fiction aficionado, you probably have heard of him, who writes an article in 1945 in this publication speculating that it should be possible to send communication signals one part of the Earth to the other by bouncing them off a satellite in space. That's science fiction. In the early 50s, an AT&T Bell Labs scientist named John Pierce, who we see here, says, no, this can be done. And he convinces the hierarchy to fund the program. Well, the program, in designing one, there are the three main components. One is those transistors. Two, one of the inventions I didn't get to talk about, the first practical solar cell. And there's one of those on loan from AT&T in the museum as well. The third is what you see here is a traveling wave tube, which is a millimeter frequency amplifier. So a big team of people get together, get NASA involved because they're the only people who have the ability to actually launch a satellite, and succeed. By 1960, they are building these satellites in a plant in Hillside, New Jersey. This is testing. I know it's in New Jersey, but the information that came with the photo doesn't tell me which facility. I think it's probably, it may be Whippany, but I can't be sure. And so they plan, NASA agrees to launch it. The size of the and weight of the satellite are determined by the payload NASA can launch into space. They build 3 ground stations for it. One, AT&T builds a ground station in Andover, Maine, kind of an isolated community where there's not going to be a lot of radio interference. The French and British government telephone authorities build similar ground stations on their Atlantic coasts, in Cornwall and Brittany. And in July 1962, satellite is launched. It is an enormously successful experiment. First live transmission of television across the ocean. That other new technology, the undersea telephone cables, just didn't have the bandwidth. So here we see the first image live TV image ever transmitted, and it's the flag, American flag, outside of the Andover ground station. And there's a whole lot of things. There's clips from a Chicago Cubs ball game. There's part of President Kennedy's press conference. In the other direction, the French send a film of Yves Montand singing, and the British, for some reason, among other things, send a cooking show. I never understood that. But they also sent television. In addition to television, they sent They sent still images, facsimiles, they sent data, they sent just plain old telephone calls, a widely successful experiment. There were 6 of these built in Hillside, 2 launched into space. 4, well, it wasn't clear that 2 would be how many would be launched, but there were 4 spares, and right now you can see one of them in the garden room at the museum. Finally, cellular telephony. Now this is, now we're getting into something that, well, it goes way back, but, well, I dare say every one of you has one of those on your person. In 1946, AT&T introduces mobile telephone service. Notice I said mobile, not cellular. Basically, there was one transmitter for an entire city or metropolitan area. That meant no more than a handful of people could make mobile calls at a given time. Moreover, the equipment weighed about, you're talking vacuum tubes, weighed about 80 pounds and would cause the lights in your car to dim. Not scalable, but real. And this was rolled out across the country over the next few years, but there could be no more than a handful of people making a call at once, which meant the number of people who actually had one was carefully controlled by the local telephone companies, and there's all sorts of lists of priorities, like who had the most urgent need to have one of these handful of phones. The next year, 1947, a Bell Labs engineer named Douglas Ring, who we see here, did a thought experiment. What would be the characteristics you'd need for a scalable system? And the telephone was, you know, something that not quite ubiquitous over you know, somewhere over half the population had one in their home by this time. What would it take to do that? And he comes up with the basic concept for cellular telephony. He writes this up in a formal internal proprietary technical memorandum. It's a standard way the labs use to share information across the big population of researchers. And of course, that's another thing in my vault. Anyway, this is the key diagram. If you look at this diagram, what you will see is the basic concept for cellular telephony. You see these cells. You see the numbers repeat. Those numbers are different frequencies, different transmitters. As a car travels down the road and moves from one cell to the next, it moves from one frequency to another. There's enough power you can repeat the frequencies. There's only one problem with this. The technology to do it didn't exist. There's no way to automatically hand off a call as a car drives down the road. This retreats into the background. It's never quite completely forgotten, but Ring goes on to other areas of radio research. But AT&T was always after the Federal Communications Commission for more radio spectrum to at least increase how many people could make those limited mobile calls. In 1966, the FCC comes to AT&T and says, if we gave you a bunch of frequency, bunch of spectrum, what could you do with it? Could you design a scalable system? And they put this mechanical engineer named Richard Frankiel to work. He's in Holmdel, Bell Labs in Holmdel. Then they seem to lose interest. Then 2 years later, they come back and said, no, we really mean it. And Frankel, now a whole team gets together, and Frankel starts with Ring's work, but then quickly moves past it. And they bring in a whole nother team based in Whippany, Joel Engel, the key players there, who are experts in radio engineering. Between 1968 and 1971, they develop a complete system, all on paper, for how to do this. And the reason they can do this is because now there's a way to hand off those calls, mainframe computers. Those electronic telephone switches, which are special purpose computers. So there's now the technology to do it. Indeed, there are hundreds of patents that go into this, but the key one is probably the patent for doing that from AT&T Bell Labs top switching expert, Amos Joel. So in 1971, they produced two versions of this document. A fat one, which is all the details that the Bell system needs to know to do it, and a thinner one to answer all the FCC questions. And the FCC sits on it for a decade. Why? No, well, here's the thing. AT&T assumed that cellular telephony would be an extension of the Bell system, which back then was the national telephone monopoly. Some people objected, most notably Motorola, which had a very profitable business providing the equipment for private mobile radio telephone service, things like police dispatching, taxi services. So the FCC sat on it for a decade. The good news is that during that decade, all sorts of additional improvements were made to the system. They kept doing the research. They kept doing, this is one case. This is a field test in 1978, I believe, in Newark, where they put up an experimental system. And these are two Bell Labs researchers who are testing out, what they're testing at this point is an experimental handset for the system. Tom Zuoko in the front is on an experimental mobile phone, and Fred Hare in the back is taking notes and taking measurements. So finally, in the early 1980s, the FCC reached a decision. They will license two different carriers in each marketplace. One license will be reserved for the incumbent wireline company, which for the most part was a local telephone company. The second one would be for somebody else. Who got to be that somebody else is a really interesting, complicated, bizarre story, but not for today. With this, by now the Bell system is in the middle of being broken up by an antitrust suit filed in '74, agreement in '82. But with this, AT&T and the soon to be divested local telephone company Ameritech in the upper Midwest introduced the first commercial cellular system in the United States in October of 1983. And from there, we get to smartphones that everyone has today. Those are my 6 stories.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
So now we have some time, about 15 minutes or so for questions. I did want to mention.
15 minutes?
Okay, sorry. I did want to mention that for those who are joining us virtually, if you could please add your questions in the Q&A box. We'll take a look at those throughout the course of our Q&A as well. So anybody?
I do have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Sheldon, these stories are fabulous. Thank you so much. But
You're welcome.
one of the most fun things, because I have spent time with you, is the human side behind all of this.
Yeah.
And if you could talk a little bit about the corporate culture and the long hallways and the lunchroom and things like that.
Okay, well, you're specifically talking about the culture at Bell Labs rather than, which had its own culture, somewhat different from the culture of other parts of the old Bell system. Yeah, the Bell Labs tried to, from early on, set an environment for to encourage people to collaborate casually, not necessarily there are formal things like the System of Technical Memoranda. So the culture will concentrate on Murray Hill, on the largest facility in New Jersey. The building just kind of grew one addition at a time. but there were lots of long corridors, and the culture developed that people would keep their doors open, and you were welcome if you needed an expert in some field. You could go, poke your head in their door. And even more so, it turned out the way the corridors were laid out, people ran into each other, further encouraging this kind of casual exchange. The cafeteria served as a central point for it. Interestingly enough, and this just happened organically, interestingly enough, when it came to design the facility in Holmdel in the beginning in the late 50s, they kept that, and they tried, the famous architect Eero Saarinen tried to do that deliberately, and it didn't work nearly as well. But that was part of the culture. Another part of the culture, remember, this is the national telephone monopoly. And as I've just shown you, it was extremely innovative. And there's this cliche, which isn't true, that monopolies aren't innovative. I just gave you 6 examples. But that's not to say that being a monopoly did not influence the patterns of innovation. And this transistor story is a great thing. If you're a monopoly and you have innovation as part of your DNA, which is true of not just Bell Labs, but why was Bell Labs supported? This was true on the corporate level as well. It meant that you didn't have to worry about the next quarter, or you didn't have to worry if your competitors beat you to some innovation, because there weren't any. So Bell Labs could take a very long point of view. And that's one of the things I love about telling the transistor story, not just because of the importance of the transistor, but the research begins in 1936. The original goal is reached in 1965, 39 years. So that is another part. It also meant that the company could take the time to get things right as to a certain engineer's definition of right, of robustness. So in the monopoly days, you'd never roll out anything all over the nation at once. So when touch tone service was introduced, that's where you didn't have to turn a dial but push buttons. In 1963, it was initially introduced in 2 towns on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, Greenburgh and Carnegie. It worked there, then it spreads through the system. So it was a very fertile culture for innovation, and it was a very distinct culture shaped in part by the particulars of the Bell system.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions? Gentleman in the back there.
Yeah, it's a big one. Looking back as a historian, what's the perspective on this divestiture? I mean, in some ways, my father was an engineer at the time, and in some ways it seems like a really stupid thing to and then, sort of related to that, has essentially companies like Google, I mean, they have so many billions that they do have laboratories that they're just letting these guys, play around with artificial intelligence and so forth without worrying about the next quarter. So sort of 2 questions there.
Okay, I can't answer your second question. I'm a historian and you're asking me about current events. It's just outside my expertise. The first question I can and I will address. Okay, divestiture, there are a couple things. First off, the whole background is in 1913, the government accepted, and it was part of the settlement of the first antitrust suit brought against AT&T, that the telephone, by the nature of its technology, was a natural monopoly and would be best operated in the interest of the American people as a single system under the direction of AT&T, under regulation. Monopolies always stuck in the craw of the American body politics. There's a second antitrust suit brought in 1949 based on an investigation done by the newly created Federal Communications Commission in the 30s for World War II, and then the third one breaks it up. So that's one thing. The second thing, the divestiture, I'd say it was a mixed, in a sense, it was a mixed bag. One thing that I noticed was that while AT&T was innovative, the way it was innovative was shaped by it being a monopoly. The rate at which old technology was replaced by a new technology was shaped by factors such as depreciation costs, and what happened after divestiture was some things were lost. I mean, all of these things I talked about are things of the divestiture era. It's not that AT&T stopped innovating in 1984, but it's that you now have competition. Example, one of the big innovations I could have talked about, but I didn't, was the development of fiber optic transmission. And it's all long distance transmission today is fiber optics and rapid laser pulses over extremely pure glass fibers and cables. Okay, this started to be rolled out. The first big splash was done as a demo project for the 1980 Winter Olympics in Lake Placid. Lake Placid didn't have the infrastructure. It's a little town in the middle of nowhere for the communication needs of an Olympics, live television. And so first long distance fiber optic cables, 1982. You have competition. You have newer competitive long distance networks. Sprint advertises that you can hear a pin drop, that their newly built network is all fiber optics. Every year, AT&T announced it was accelerating the schedule of replacing the older copper coaxial cables and the microwave relay systems with fiber optics. Competition causes an acceleration. So something was lost and something was gained. And I'm not sure where the balance between those two. I mean, it's a complicated question. It's not something, like often in history, it's not something with a simple answer.
So, can you tell us a little bit more about the leaders, to have a culture of innovation, so they're a monopoly, and they can take a long view, but to actually sustain that and have a 30-year view, were the leaders of AT&T like from the ranks, or were they brought in?
Okay. The leaders were almost everybody I've spoken about, and I've just spoken about the Bell Labs people. I have not spoken about the corporate leaders, are people who spent their careers there.
No, but I mean the corporate leaders.
Basically, the first person ever hired from the outside to lead AT&T is in the late 1990s. Okay, and we won't go into him, but basically, so let's take the greatest business leader in AT&T's history I mentioned briefly was Theodore Vail. Again, it's because I'm giving a talk on innovation. I have another talk I give where I talk about the corporate history. Okay, so Vail is hired in 1878, right? Telephone's invented in 1876, to a position that might translate as the number 2 man, general manager, would be COO in current terms of the new company. He comes from, so now of course, these early leaders have to come from somewhere. He comes from the post office, which is the universal communication system with the spirit of service. Vail has disputes and leaves in 1890. He gets rehired in 1907 for his second stint as president of AT&T. and brings with him this. Vail sets the structure for the Bell system that exists until the 1980s. The way the parts are put together, the way the service ethos, this driving goal of universal service, which has complex meanings to Vail, but by his successors in the 20s means it is the goal of AT&T that someday everybody will have a telephone, which was achieved in the 1960s. So this passes down. Yes, all of the leaders of AT&T are people who work their way up. Bob Allen, who I got to know a little bit, was CEO from 86 to 96, was started out as an engineer in Indiana Bell straight out of college. And this would have been typical.
Questions. So I think any other questions here? Okay. One from the internet.
So Jonah is asking, is it possible to comment on computing and software innovation at AT&T and the Bell Labs system?
Yes. I'm sorry. He actually asked me to comment, not to say whether it's. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I can be a wise ass. Yeah. Okay. So, well, there's some very interesting things going on here. The most. First off, under the 1956 consent decree, I remember I said there were 3 antitrust suits, which was largely seen as a win for AT&T. AT&T agreed to restrict its operations to things connected with running the national telephone system and projects for the government. And that was largely Cold War work. About a third of Bell Labs' work in the 1950s was government contracts related to the Cold War. So AT&T was kind of restricted in what it can do in computing for the rest of the monopoly period, which isn't to say they didn't do anything. For one thing, those electronic telephone switches are special purpose computers. They're programmed. That's software. And indeed, there are many pioneering software patents. That the second thing they did, if you go back to the mainframe era, software was almost universally computer specific. It was designed to work with a particular computer and designed by people writing software to a large degree who work for IBM or one of its 7 smaller competitors. You've probably heard of something called Unix. Unix is a computer operating system invented between 69 and 71 at Bell Labs by a team led by Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson. Unix quickly became known because it was the first computer operating system written to be hardware independent, to be able to be ported to multiple hardware. As a result, Unix's descendants are everywhere. Unix's descendants are the underlying computer language of the internet. If you dig deep enough into Microsoft Windows, into Apple's operating systems, you'll find deep down it's derived from Unix.
Excellent. Have a question in the back there.
I hope this is not an unfair question. My antenna twitched when I saw Shockley. I just did a quick look up, and I didn't know I got a Nobel Prize. All I knew was generally eugenics. I wonder if you could comment in any way.
Shockley is a big embarrassment. Basically, Shockley took his fame from winning the Nobel Prize to become one of the leading, very public advocates of racist eugenics. That's an embarrassment. Now, this, in a sense, in one level, it shouldn't um, you should be able to separate it from his earlier achievements as a physicist. Did Shockley deserve his share of the Nobel Prize? Yes. On the other hand, would I much rather talk about Bardeen and Bratton because they're admirable people and Shockley is an embarrassment? Yes. Well, one thing I can say is the patent has two names on it, Bardeen and Bratton. But yeah, there's no way Shockley's behavior is defendable.
Just a quick question. If I call London now, will this call go through a satellite? How much?
No.
It's all undersea.
Well, here's the thing. The problem is there was a period in the 70s and 80s when satellites supplemented the existing copper wire. The problem is the length the signal has to travel. There's a half-second lag. You could always tell during the days when satellites were used for telephone communications if you got a satellite link rather than a wired link. Fortunately, the coming of fiber optics solved that problem. The last copper submarine cable had a capacity of 4,000 calls. The first fiber optic cable a few years later in 1988 had a capacity 10 times that. Today, the vast bulk of what travels over that is data and video. But if you were to measure it in telephone circuits, it would be in the millions and millions. So no, satellites are not. The only place they'd be used if you're in some place so remote there's no other contact. I mean, you've probably seen reports of people from battlefield areas reporting over satellite phones. So it's just in that specialized niche.
We have time for maybe one more question. We'll take you right there in the back.
Yes, I grew up down the hill from Murray Hill, and the fathers of a number of my friends and high school classmates worked there, and I was always impressed by their service ethic and by their commitment to a company over their entire lives. I can't think, I've been trying to think tonight of any of my friends' fathers who left the company, and I can't think of anybody over 30, 40 years.
Yeah, I mean, there are, yes, that's very much the case. Basically, Bell Labs, in the period I'm talking about, was considered one of the best places you could possibly work if you could get hired there. You got to do research, though you got to do development too. I mean, we talk about these researchers, but that's only 10%. You know, that's why I made sure I talked about the guys who took the transistor invention and spent 3 years turning it into something you could manufacture. But one comment was, you got to do research. While the company never kept in mind what was potentially relevant to the business of AT&T, the freedom could be enormous. And you got to spend your full time doing research. The alternative was go to a university where you had to teach, attend committee meetings, grade papers. I mean, I've had Bell Labs retirees tell me that frankly. Why would I ever want to, you know? And it appealed to the person who didn't want to do all those other things. I mean, were there occasions that people left? Yeah. One of the most famous ones is John Bardeen. He left mainly because he got to the point where he couldn't stomach being in the same room with Shockley. He went to the University of Illinois, where he earned his second Nobel Prize in a whole other area of physics, superconductivity. But that's an unusual case.
Thank you so much. This is captivating talk and Q&A session. We encourage you to see the Nobel exhibition if you have not already done so. Sheldon was a huge resource for our team for that exhibition, really invaluable. So thank you again and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
But